if you have your Bibles or mobile devices or whatever you're going to read the scriptures with, we're going to be in the small letter of Philemon. It's right before Hebrews and right after Titus. Well, it's funny they call it the book of Philemon, but it's really not a book. It's a letter. So as you guys are turning there, I'm going to give you a little bit of background information on this letter of Philemon. In the chronology of the writings of the Apostle Paul of Rav Shaul, this is said to be the ninth of writing, canonical writing that we have of Rav Shaul, the Apostle Paul. And like I said, I don't like calling it the book of Philemon because it's not a book. It's an epistle, which means letter. It's a letter. It was written around 62 AD during Paul's first 2-year house arrest in Rome. And you can find the evidence for that in Acts chapter 28, verses 16 through 31. So Paul was under house arrest in Rome, and apparently this is where he wrote the letter to Philemon. Because of the mention of Philemon's slave, Onesimus, in Colossians 1:9, it's likely that Philemon lived in Colossae. And Colossae, where it is today, it would be now what is called Western Turkey. So that's where the Colossians lived, is in Western Turkey. Philemon was likely a well-to-do convert of Apostle Paul's ministry, and we see that in Philemon 1:19, and it reads, "I, Paul, am writing with my own hand, and I will repay, not to mention that you owe me your very self." So that kind of hints and alludes. Well, it says, okay, basically Paul's saying, you owe your life to me.
He's so arrogant.
Well, it's the way you're reading it. It's not the way that he meant it. He says, "I, Paul, am writing with my own hand, and I will repay." And we'll get into what he means to repay here in a little bit. It says, "Not to mention that you owe me your very self." So, this kind of alludes to and hints that the Apostle Paul likely led Philemon to the Lord. So he kind of saved his life, spiritually speaking, in a way. We're going to go through the whole letter of Philemon today. It's only 25 verses. And so we'll better understand the context of that, and it won't sound so arrogant once we get into that particular passage that I just read. So Paul likely visited and ministered in Colossae during his 3-year stay in Ephesus. And so when he sent his letter to the Colossians and to Ephesus, most likely the guy who took the letter was Tychus, one of the Apostle Paul's assistants. And the letter to Philemon was delivered by Tychus, but it was also delivered by Onesimus himself. And Onesimus was Philemon's runaway slave. And we'll get into all that. It's really good stuff. So let's go ahead and read Philemon 1 through 7. And it says, "Paul, a prisoner of Messiah Yeshua, and Timothy our brother, to Philemon, our beloved fellow worker." So here he addresses Philemon as a fellow worker. What we can gather is most likely he was a lay leader in a house congregation there in Colossae. And it most likely met in his home. If he had a runaway slave named Onesimus, it must meant that he was pretty well-to-do. That if he had money to have a slave, he was probably, maybe not stinking filthy rich, but rich enough to have a slave. So it's believed that the congregation actually met in his house. So this was around the time where a lot of believing Jews and a lot of believing Gentiles were no longer welcome in local synagogues, so they started meeting in each other's homes. It says, "To Aphia, our sister, and to Archippus, our fellow soldier, and to the community that meets in your house." And when he says your house, the letter is addressed to Philemon, so that kind of gives you a hint that this congregation met in Philemon's home. Philemon was therefore a lay leader, and Aphia and Archippus were likely the leaders of that congregation. Some believe that Aphia was actually Philemon's wife, but it seems that Archippus was probably the congregational leader of that home group. It says, "Grace to you and shalom," meaning peace, "from God our Father and the Lord Messiah Yeshua. I thank my God always when mentioning you in my prayers, hearing of your love and the trust that you have toward the Lord Yeshua and all his holy ones. May the fellowship of your faith become effective with the recognition of all good that is in our Messiah. For I have received much joy and comfort in your love, brother, because the heart of the holy ones, the Kedoshim in the Hebrew, have been refreshed through you. So Philemon was apparently a very active lay leader in this home church, in this congregation, in this community in Colossae in Western Turkey. So Paul is sort of buttering Philemon up because he's got a real serious matter he's got to address to Philemon. So he's kind of like, buttering him up and paying him many, many compliments to prepare him for the bombshell that he's about to drop on this guy. So we can also read about Archippus being the elder or the leader of a congregation in Colossians 4:17. So Colossians and Philemon can be read together because most likely Colossians was addressed to probably many different house churches and home congregations there in Colossae. And one of those was the very congregation that Philemon was a part of that met in his house, who the elder Archippus was the elder of. All right, so let's move on to verses 8 through 20. And here is the meat of the letter. This is the main purpose of the letter. If I could maybe put a title to this Bible study or to this lesson, I would be calling it Pacifying Philemon. Because he's trying to pacify Philemon, because Philemon was most likely a little bit irritated and a little bit angry because his slave ran away. And most likely he ran away because either Onesimus really did steal something from him, or he was accused of stealing from his master Philemon, and he didn't want to be around to deal with any of the repercussions, that was going to come upon him for theft or accused theft. So beginning at verse 8, it says, "Therefore I have plenty of boldness in Messiah to order you to do what is right." Now, we've got to understand the structure of leadership in the home groups and the home churches. Rav Shaul, the Apostle Paul, he was the one who founded a lot of these home groups. He was a church planter, as we would say in Protestant Christianity. He was a church planter. He founded congregations. He would find people that had leadership abilities, leadership qualities, and he would entrust the congregation to them, and he would end up moving on and start planting other congregations elsewhere. So they looked to the Apostle Paul kind of as a spiritual father, but also as a spiritual authority, because they were still going by a lot of Jewish customs and traditions in these home churches. And the way that it was set up was that if there was ever a dispute, the dispute would be brought before a Beit Din. Now, a Beit Din is Hebrew, and it means house of judgment. And what a house of judgment was, is it was the elders of that congregation that met together and decided on, the judgments of whatever dispute came up between members or whatever. And whatever the elders decided, they had to do it. That was law, And that was to keep all these petty little arguments out of secular courts and out of the Roman courts, and therefore giving believers a bad name because believers were taking believers to court. And we read that in other parts of Scripture as well. So if the elders couldn't come up with a decision on their own, they would defer to Paul and say, "Hey, look, we got this problem. We really don't know what the right answer is or what the right solution is. We need you to weigh in on this issue." So it says, "Therefore, though I have plenty of boldness in Messiah to order you to do what's right." So the Apostle Paul was kind of like showing, I do have the final say in things. If, I could put my foot down if I want to. But I'm not that kind of guy, and that's not my intentions, and that's not what I'm going to do. Because he goes on to say, "Yet, for love's sake, I appeal to you instead." So instead of twisting your arm and making you do what I want you to do, I'm going to appeal to your heart. And I'm going to appeal to the Holy Spirit that is in you and the converted heart that you have, because I want you to make the right decision. I don't want to have to force you to make the right choice. "Yet for love's sake, I appeal to you instead. I, Paul, am an old man, and now also a prisoner belonging to Messiah Yeshua. I beg you for my child Onesimus. Other translations say son. So he kind of spiritually adopted Onesimus as his son. And we see that Paul has done that with a couple other guys, prominent guys, Timothy and Titus being one of them, right? And in the letters to 1st and 2nd Timothy and the letter to Titus, Paul addresses these young men as his sons. And again, that's another part of rabbinical tradition. Whenever a rabbi had students, the Hebrew word for student is talmidim. We understand that as disciples. But whenever a rabbi would have students, it was more of a father-son type relationship. Because, just like a father would take a son and show a son a trade, like Joseph taught Jesus, Yeshua, how to be a carpenter, a rabbi would teach his spiritual sons, his students, to be good rabbis, to be good pastors, to be good ministers. And so he adopted Timothy and Titus as spiritual sons, and that's just to show the rabbi-student relationship of that day. So he also calls Onesimus his son. Now the interesting thing about Onesimus is we don't really know how Onesimus came to find Paul, whether it was just by chance, by divine providence, or if Onesimus actually sought Paul out. Either way, it's pretty amazing that Onesimus ran into Paul, because Paul was under house arrest in Rome, and that was a city of 1,005,000 people. You didn't have tracking apps back then. You didn't have Facebook check-in. You didn't have phone books. You had to ask around and do a lot of legwork to find out where somebody lived or where somebody was, especially if somebody was a prisoner and under house arrest. You probably had to ask around a lot. So, I think it's pretty amazing that Onesimus found the Apostle Paul in a city with over 1,005,000 people.
Can I tell you something right away?
Sure.
Just real quick on what you're saying. When I was 14 years old, I was in the reform school for girls, and there was this one counselor I didn't like. Anyway, moving into the future, I'm about 16 years old, haven't seen her, decided to hitchhike everywhere. Ottawa, Montreal, last stop was Toronto. And I was sitting on a bench, and lo and behold, there's Mrs. Upshaw.
Wow.
I said, come on, give me a break, So I got the last say. I remember how mean you were to me, especially me. Don't talk to me anymore. Like her, 1.5 million people, she walks by.
That's amazing. That's just either God's got to. Yeah.
It's uncanny. I won't get into everything, but man, though I don't know if I'm blessed or cursed, but things do come around.
Yeah, that's divine providence.
Yeah.
So verse 10, it says, I beg you for my child Onesimus, for whom I have become a spiritual father while in chains. So either if Onesimus sought him out or just by chance ran into Paul, happened to find him, I think it's pretty amazing that he found him. And it was definitely for a purpose. So it says, verse 11, he once was useless to you, but now useful both to you and me. I sent him back to you. He is my very heart. I really wanted to keep him with me so that on your behalf he might serve me while I'm in chains for the good news, for the gospel. But I didn't want to do anything without your consent, so that your goodness wouldn't be by force, but by free will. For perhaps he was separated from you for a while, in order that you might have him back forever, no longer a slave, but more than a slave, as a beloved brother, especially to me, but even more so to you, both in the flesh and in the Lord. So if you consider me a partner, welcome him as you would welcome me. But if he has done you any wrong or owes you anything, charge it to my account. I, Paul, am writing with my own hand, and I will repay, not to mention that you owe me your very self. Yes, brother, let me have some benefit from you in the Lord. Refresh my heart in Messiah. So, I had actually written a commentary on the book of Philemon, so I was going to just actually read to you some of my thoughts on verses 8 through 20 that we just read. So it says, "The Rav Shaul, the Apostle Paul's personal letter, we see grace in accordance with strict observance of the Torah," strict observance of the law. You're probably thinking, what does the 5 books of Moses have to do with the letter to Philemon? Well, we're about to find out. So, though the Apostle Paul's personal letter, we see grace in accordance with strict observance of the law. We see why Paul was a Rav. A Rav is a step above a rabbi. A rabbi is a teacher. A Rav is sort of like, a rabbi would be like pastor. A Rav would be like doctor.
So, like, Jesus was like a Rav?
Yeah, he was a Rav. It was almost like he was, like, it would be equivalent of having a doctorate today.
Do they have Ravs today?
Yep. Yeah, they're usually the leader of, a big Jewish organization or sect. So yeah, they're still Ravs today. Yeah. So we see that why Shaul or Paul was a Rav due to his masterful handling of this situation regarding Philemon's runaway slave Onesimus. The Torah addresses this in Deuteronomy chapter 23, verses 15 and 16. So the law, the Torah actually has a protocol when it comes to runaway slaves. A lot of you didn't know that, but it says, "Thou shalt not deliver unto his master the servant which is escaped from his master unto you." So it was against the Torah, it was against the law for Paul to send Onesimus back. Because if a slave ran away, there was probably a good reason why the slave ran away. He was either abused or he was falsely accused of something. I mean, it had to be so bad that he had to run away for some reason or another. And the Torah asks the Israelites to remember that they were slaves once in Egypt and put themselves in that runaway slave's shoes. Would they want to be sent back to their master? Would they want to be sent back to Pharaoh? Would they want to be sent back to the mud pits and the brick making and all this kind of stuff? So it says, "Thou shalt not deliver unto his master the servant which is escaped from his master unto you. He shall dwell with you, even among you, in that place which he shall choose in one of thy gates, where it liketh him best, and you shall not oppress him." So basically the Torah, the law says, if there's a runaway slave that comes to you or comes to your community, you can't rat him out. You can't force him to go back to his master. You can't send him back to his master. But you can allow him to stay wherever he wants in the land. Let him pick where he wants to stay and settle down. And let him be a part of the community. Don't look down on him. Don't treat him any differently. Don't oppress him. Because remember, you were slaves too once. You know how it feels. The purpose of this personal letter of Philemon was in an attempt to bring a peaceful, Torah-based solution and resolution to this matter. It is apparent that both Philemon and Onesimus were Gentile converts. They were used to the Greek system of understanding slavery and a slave's relationship to their owner, as opposed to a Hebraic understanding of slavery. So the way a Hebrew would deal with a slave is totally different than the way a Greek or a Roman would deal with a slave. The Greek and Roman would deal with a slave as, you're a dog, you're less than, you're my property, I can treat you and do with you however I want. And nobody can say boo about it. I can even kill you if I want, and it's no big deal. As opposed to the Hebraic understanding of slavery, where it was more like an employer-employee relationship. Because even slaves had rights. Back in the Bible times, that was a revolutionary concept. A slave having rights? That's pretty bizarre, but a slave had rights. If a slave got their eye poked out, the guy would have to set him free because of his eye. Even if he had his tooth knocked out, he would have to let the slave go because of the loss of his tooth. So those are pretty interesting rights. So it says, under Roman law, a runaway slave could be punished by death. So you can understand how probably fearful Onesimus was. If somebody was to rat him out or to send him back to Philemon, he could have him executed for that. Under Roman law, a runaway slave could be punished by death, but seeing as both parties in this conundrum were now believers in Messiah Yeshua, They were to resolve their problem by a Beit Din, by a house of judgment within their Messianic community, and not by the secular authorities of the Roman government. Rav Shaul, the Apostle Paul, being a master of Torah law and founder of the congregation of Colossae, was accepted as the authority to resolve this situation. The issue of scriptural slavery has been taken out of context because most people look at it in the light of cruel African, Asian, and Native American slave traders. Slavery in Torah terminology between two Hebrews is best understood in regards to an indentured servant or a hired hand. So a lot of times Hebrews would find themselves on Skid Row, and because they became in debt or they were just down on their luck, they would have to become indentured to somebody else to pay off the debt or to get back on their feet again. So, if a Hebrew had a Hebrew slave, he was to treat him more like a hired hand or an indentured servant. And the best example is Abraham and Eleazar. Because Eleazar, if Ishmael or Isaac wasn't born, Eleazar was the one that was going to inherit everything Abraham had. So Eleazar was more like a son to Abraham than anything else. He trusted him. He treated him like family. He entrusted him so much so to find a good mate for his son Isaac. So, we could see that the relationship between slave and master was totally different in Hebrew understanding as opposed to a Greek or Roman understanding. Many times a Hebrew would find themselves in debt with the threatening prospect of being sold into slavery as a result. So the Torah says it's best to be indebted to a Jew as opposed to a foreigner, because the Torah gives guidelines on treatment of slaves, and it reads like an employer-employee handbook. It even makes room for a type of severance pay. Hebrew slaves are treated so well that it can turn into a full-time position. So Deuteronomy 15:12 through 18 says, "If thy brother, a Hebrew man or a Hebrew woman, be sold unto thee, and serve thee 6 years, then in the 7th year you shall let him go free." Why the 7th year? That's a special number, but there was always a canceling of debts.
Oh, was it?
Yeah.
I think put in, Rabbi.
Okay, I don't know if I can answer it, but I'll try.
Who says they had to be slaves in the first place?
Well-
You know what I mean? Like, were they born slaves? No. Like, what happened? Like, who decides who's a slave and who isn't a slave?
It's all dependent on culture. The Bible, if the Bible was written today, it would probably be written very differently than it was written back then. But because slavery existed back in the times of the Bible, God wrote the Bible in context of that culture that we find the Bible written in. So it addresses polygamy, it addresses slavery, it addresses godly ways to deal with these cultural constructs and these cultural situations. So, whereas we in the Western world have outlawed slavery, which is great, God made provisions that even though there was slavery in the Bible times, that the slaves wouldn't be ill-treated, or they wouldn't be treated unfairly, or they wouldn't be taken advantage of. They had rights. And, even way back when, women, like even in our Western culture, women couldn't vote. Women didn't have the same rights as men. But you read the Torah, and the Torah is very revolutionary because it actually gave women rights that normally they didn't have back in that time, back in that Arabian, Middle Eastern culture. And even still today, women don't have rights in, certain countries like Iran, Iraq, Saudi Arabia. But the Torah has made provisions that women get fair treatment, that they have rights, that if slavery exists, that they have rights, that if polygamy is a cultural norm in that society, that there is a biblical way to deal with that and handle that so that, all parties involved, both wives, are treated fairly and equally. So it was because of fallen man that slavery existed, because it was that issue of, one person overpowering the other, one person taking advantage of the other. And God said, okay, if this is the way you're going to live, I'm going to come in and I'm going to tell you a godly way on how to deal with it and handle it until that's resolved. So we've kind of progressed in our Western culture where we have deemed slavery not necessary, and we've outlawed it. So there were different types of slavery. There was slavery after somebody had been captured in war. There was slavery as an indentured servant because they owed debts. And we even see that take place back in England where they had workhouses. People had to work off their debt. Debtor's prison. It was called debtor's prison. So, okay, back to the Deuteronomy 15. So in the 7th year you let him go free. And when you send him out free from thee, thou shalt not let him go away empty-handed. So slaves, when they were set free in the 7th year, had a severance package. What other culture do you find that in? I've never heard of that in any other slave culture, where a slave being set free gets a severance package. Thou shalt furnish him liberally out of thy flock. So in other words, you're going to set him up so he can stand on his own 2 feet and make money himself to be a free man. You're to furnish him liberally out of the flock, and out of thy floor, and out of thy winepress, wherewith the Lord thy God has blessed you, and shall give unto him. And thou shalt remember that you were bondmen in the land of Egypt, and the Lord thy God redeemed thee. Therefore I command thee this thing today, and it shall be, if he says unto you, I will not go free from thee, because he loveth thee and thine house, and because it is well with thee. Sometimes people found themselves where they had to become a slave because they needed 3 hots and a cot, right? They couldn't make it on their own. They didn't have any resources on their own. So they allowed them to be an indentured servant or a slave to somebody. And a lot of times, life was so much better as a slave. I know that sounds bizarre, right? But they had a roof over their head. They had 3 good hot meals in their belly. And if they were enslaved to a Hebrew person, a Jewish person, they were well treated. Like I said, Eleazar was treated like a son. So they actually have a life now. They have a family. They have a community. They have friends. And they're like, man, I don't want to be on my own again. That really stunk, being on my own, where I had to scrimp and save and steal and connive and just wondered where my next meal was coming from. I've got it really good right here. I want to work for this guy for the rest of my life because I've got it so good. So there was a provision for that.
I think, just another side note, I think our view of slavery, we got it from roots.
Yes.
Yes, we got it from
Yeah,
Africa.
Kente Kente.
Yeah,
Right.
from the African heritage.
That's how we see slaves, and in the Bible time it wasn't that at all.
Well, and even in the Apostle Paul's writings, he opens virtually every letter, a slave of Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
Now, a lot of translations will try to make it nice and say a servant of Jesus Christ. No, that word in Greek and Hebrew and Aramaic is slave.
It's
Were
what
they-
we think of slavery. This is
were
what
they
you
black?
said.
Yeah.
Were they
Oh,
black?
no.
Who?
The slaves in
No,
Bible?
no.
Well, it just depends.
Might have been, but.
It just depends. I mean, Hebrews were very dark-skinned. Some would even say they were black.
No.
They were some black tribesmen. Like, we see that, like, if you see one of the wives of the 12 tribes that they married a Canaanite, Canaanites were black.
And Philip was explaining to a black man, wasn't he?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, an Ethiopian.
An Ethiopian.
And if Solomon did have sexual relations with the Queen of Sheba, there was black children from that encounter too. So there are a lot of black Jews and there are a lot of black Hebrews. But back then, Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Japheth was the father of all the Asian and Caucasian, the Asian and white people. So that's where the sons of Japheth came from. You've got the sons of Ham. They were all Canaanites. They were all black. You have Shem, which he was kind of middle of the road. He was dark complected, but he wasn't white and he wasn't black. And that's where all the Arabs and Jews come from. And people say, well, how did that happen? Well, in the apocryphal literature, the extra-biblical literature and legendary literature, it says that Noah was born different than everybody else. Up until that point, everybody was born black. You mean Adam and Eve were black? Yeah. Because scientifically, you have to have black before you can have white. You can't have white and then have black. Because black comes from the melanin in your skin. So you have to have a lot of melanin before you can have a lack of it. We white people, we have a lack of melanin. So everybody up to that point was born black. And it says in some of these apocryphal literature that Noah's hair, when he was born, was white, that his eyes were light, and his father was scared. He thought, well, maybe my child's not human. Maybe my child is part angel. Maybe he's a Nephilim. Maybe my wife had sexual relations with a fallen angel. And his father said, no, don't worry about it. It's all good. He's a normal human being. So a lot of people think that Noah was an albino. So with that genetics being put in, that gave room to have all the spectrum of color of the human race today. So when Noah had 3 sons, it's believed that they were born different shades.
That is something I wondered about.
Oh, good.
And I finally found out how they survived the flood and still.
So how did the black in the United States, if black was okay, why were they such slaves?
Well,
They went over to Africa and got
Yes.
yeah,
Yeah.
they went over.
This is different in their culture, totally different.
And because the blacks of Africa lived off the land and they lived naturally to the cultivated, intellectual, enlightened modern Westerner, they looked like savages and animals. And they thought, well, they're probably not even human. And so they enslaved them. And so anyway, and it shall be that if he says unto thee, I will not go away from thee, because he loveth thee in thine house, and because it is well with thee, then you shall take an awl, and thrust it through his ear into the door, and he shall be a servant forever. So basically, if a slave said, look, you treat me so well, I've got family and friends here, I've got good work, I want to be your slave forever. He would take that slave to the ruling authorities of that village or that community or that household, and they would take, and those elders would be witnesses to this legal transaction. They would take the slave and take an awl or an auger and hammer and pierce his ear, so that he would have a permanent hole. So that hole in the ear represented that it showed that he was a slave forever to this person. And a lot of times they would put a leather strap or something in it so the hole wouldn't close over. But yeah, it was just a cultural customary thing. So that he will be your servant forever, and also thy maidservant shall do likewise. So whether it be a male or female slave, it was the same thing. It shall not seem hard unto thee when thou sendest him away free from thee. He hath been worth double hired servant to thee, in serving 6 years, and the Lord thy God shall bless you in all that you do. So he says, send him away with flocks, with herds, with grain, with wine. Send him away so he can strike out on his own and make it on his own. And don't be stingy and don't regret this, because he done a better job than a hired person would have done. So Rav Shaul, the Apostle Paul, knew this concept real well and was proud to call himself a slave, a servant, or a bondservant to God, depending on the translation you use. We see this in Romans 1:1, Titus 1:1. Even non-Hebrew slaves serving a Hebrew had it good. And I already mentioned this. Eleazar, Abraham's servant, would have gotten everything if Ishmael and Isaac didn't come along. Abraham trusted him to find a wife for his son Isaac in Genesis 15. But the Torah says, Deuteronomy 23:15, thou shalt not deliver unto his master the servant which escaped from his master unto thee. He shall dwell with thee, even among you, in a place where he shall choose in one of thy gates, where it liketh him best, and thou shalt not oppress him. So we are always to remember that where we came from as a people, that we were once slaves in Egypt. The Apostle Paul, Rav Shaul, found himself in a tough rabbinic position. In this letter to Philemon, we see that Rav Shaul is in prison with a runaway slave named Onesimus. Rav Shaul, knowing the Torah full well, probably had these very verses in mind when dealing with this dilemma. For the verses above tell us that a Jew must not return a runaway slave to his former master. But on the other hand, apparently at some point during his stay with the Apostle Paul, Onesimus converts. He gets saved. And we see this kind of evident in verse 14. And was no longer just a Gentile slave, but a Hebrew brother in Messiah Yeshua. So the Apostle Paul convinces Onesimus upon his release to return this letter to Philemon. The letter implores Philemon to receive Onesimus back as a brother, verse 16. So Rav Shaul even vouches for Philemon that he himself would be held responsible if Philemon indeed stole anything or damaged something in any way. And we see that in verse 18. So basically, the Apostle Paul, he's like, according to the laws of God, Onesimus, I can't make you go back. I can't make you go back to Philemon, but the situation would be best if you do. So I'm giving you the choice whether to go back to Philemon or not. And if I send you back with Philemon, or send you back to Philemon, I will send you with a letter, and I will go before you to kind of smooth the way, butter him up, and pave the way so that he'll realize that you came back a different man, that you're not the same man that ran away. You're totally different. So that was his way of solving this problem, because if Paul forced Onesimus to return to Philemon, he would be breaking the Torah. He would be breaking the law of God. So he's appealing to Philemon to say, look, receive Onesimus back, not as a slave, but as a brother. And Onesimus, don't return, to him just because he's your master, but because you want to, because you have a ministry, you have a good work to do with Philemon, that you're not slave and master anymore. You're more like employer, employee. You're more like brothers now. I imagine Rav Shaul, the Apostle Paul, was thinking of a good relationship that Abraham and Eleazar had as a model for Philemon, for Onesimus and his master Philemon, which was similar to a father-son relationship rather than a slave-master or even employer-employee. In our dealings with each other, let us always keep in mind that whatever the situation we may find ourselves in, that we are family and that we need to treat each other as such. So let's go back and dig in a little bit deeper in verses 8 and 9. Therefore, though I have plenty of boldness in Messiah to order you to do what's right, yet for love's sake I appeal to you instead. I, Paul, am an old man, and now also a prisoner belonging to Messiah Yeshua. So Paul founded the congregation in Colossae, and it was likely led, and as a result, this founding of this congregation in Colossae was likely what led Philemon to the Lord. The Apostle Paul was seen as an apostolic rabbinic authority, and that he had the right to make definitive decisions that Philemon would be obligated to obey. So he could have forced Philemon to do the right thing, but he says, no, I'm not going to go that route. I want to appeal to your heart, and I want this to be a free will decision of your own. So instead of forcing him by just putting his foot down, making an apostolic rabbinic decision, he wanted to appeal to his heart as a fellow believer. So he wanted a free will decision out of respect and love and not forced. So verse 10, again, we see says, I beg you for my child or my son Onesimus, for whom I became a spiritual father while in chains. So he calls Onesimus a son. And Onesimus, he did the same thing with Timothy and Titus. He called them sons too, as we mentioned earlier. So it means that Onesimus converted and became a student of the Apostle Paul. So we find a little bit of a play on words here in verse 11. It says, he, meaning Onesimus, was once useless to you, but now he is useful to you and me. So Onesimus means useful. Onesimus means profitable. So apparently he was useless and profitless because Onesimus ran away. He was a runaway slave. How profitable or how useful could a slave be if he runs away? Right? So he says Onesimus was once useless. So it was kind of using a play on words here. To you, but is useful to you and me both. So he's useful now. And as a result of Onesimus' conversion, his changed heart, his changed as a man from the inside out, he has now become useful. So you could probably remember when you first came to the Lord that you were just really zealous and wanted to serve God, and you wanted to be plugged in somewhere and doing something and active in ministry and active in helping out and active in learning. And so this was probably, Onesimus's honeymoon phase of being converted. Nelson's Illustrated Dictionary of the Bible says that Onesimus may be the same as the Bishop Onesimus of Ephesus, praised in a letter by Ignatius, Bishop of Antioch. So we see that Onesimus was more than just a runaway slave. We see a lot of, rags to riches stories of slaves becoming inventors or slaves becoming politicians in U.S. and Canadian history. Well, in this case, Onesimus ended up becoming a leader, a bishop in Ephesus, which Ephesus and Colossae were very close to each other. And so Onesimus is mentioned in a letter by Ignatius, and Ignatius was a disciple of one of the original apostles. And Ignatius was bishop of Antioch. So, if so, then we see that eventually Onesimus was freed by Philemon. So if Onesimus actually ends up becoming the future bishop of Ephesus, at some point Onesimus lets him go free or gives him his freedom. Verse 12. I sent him back to you. So we know that if the Apostle Paul sent Onesimus back, he didn't force Onesimus to go, because that would have been against the law. It would have been against the Torah, the law of God. So Onesimus was willing to go back. So I send him back to you. He is my very heart. So he's saying, I've poured my blood, sweat, and tears. I've poured my very soul into Onesimus. What I put into Onesimus was everything that I had to give within me. So I tried to make Onesimus, every rabbi tries to make their student or their disciple or their Talmud like them. That's what Yeshua did. He said, I want you to be like me. The Apostle Paul, in many of his letters, he says, be an imitator of me. Imitate me. Do what I do. So I want you to learn by example. I want you to learn by doing what I do. So he says, I send him back to you. He is my very heart. I really want to keep him with me. So we see a little bit of covetousness with the Apostle Paul. He's like, wow, this Onesimus, this useless runaway slave, has become very useful. He's been a great help to me since he's been with me here in Rome. Boy, I'd like to keep him for myself. I'd like for him to be, my helper, my servant. I really wanted to keep him with me so that on your behalf he might serve me while I am in chains for the good news. Because if Paul was under house arrest, he needed somebody to run his errands. He needed somebody to help him out with certain tasks and things that he couldn't do because he didn't have the freedom. But I didn't want to do anything without your consent. So there he's acknowledging that Philemon has proper ownership of Onesimus, that he is, the master. And he wouldn't do anything, even though he was an apostle, even though he had the apostolic rabbinic authority to probably nullify a slave contract or to say, well, I'm going to keep him with me. He's not going to play those power cards. He's wanting to respect Philemon's rights. He's wanting to respect Onesimus' rights. And so he says, but I didn't want to do anything without your consent so that your goodness wouldn't be by force but by free will. So you can twist somebody's arm to do something and then they can kind of say, oh, okay, and they really don't want to do it. So he wants Philemon, he wants it all to be of his own free will because he wants to, not because he has to. Okay, verses 15 and 16. For perhaps he was separated from you for a while in order that you might have him back forever. What's that crazy saying that you let something go free and if it's meant to be, it'll return back to you or something like that? That's kind of what I thought of when I read that verse. So it says, for perhaps he was separated from you for a while in order that you might have him back forever, no longer as a slave, but more than a slave, as a beloved brother, especially to me, because even more so to you, both in the flesh and in the Lord. So he says, look, Onesimus ran away as a slave. He's returning to you on his own free will, on his own volition. He's returning to you not as a slave, but as a fellow brother. As a fellow brother in the Lord. Receive him as such. And he wanted Philemon to kind of live up to his name. Verse 17 says, so if you consider me a partner, welcome him as you would welcome me. So we see he kind of ups the ante because he says in verse 10, Onesimus is my son. So at first he wants Philemon to receive him as he would Titus or Timothy. Because if he sent Titus or Timothy to Philemon, Philemon roll out the red carpet and give the very best. And he's calling Onesimus his son. He's like, receive him as a son. But then he goes a step further later on in the letter. He says, no, receive him as you would me. Welcome him as you would me. Now, Philemon, his name means brotherly love in the Greek. Yeah, this comes from the Greek word phileo or filio. It's where we get the word Philadelphia. Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love, right? And there was actually Philadelphia in the book of Revelation. So he's appealing to his namesake, Philemon. He's like, I want you to love Onesimus as you would me. I want you to love him and accept him and receive him back as a brother. You know, I've poured so much of myself into Onesimus, it's as if I'm sending him as an ambassador of myself to you. Receive him as an ambassador. Receive him as if you would me. He's no longer just a slave. He's your brother. He's going to be profitable to you because he's been profitable to me. Verses 18 and 19. But if he has done you any wrong, so we see here's the crux of the matter. This is probably why Onesimus ran away. Because Onesimus probably, he may have stole something because he wasn't converted then, right? He might have stole something, or he was accused of stealing something. So instead of being caught or having to deal with the repercussions of being framed, which would be death under Roman law, he ran away. But if he has done you any wrong or owes you anything, charge it to my account. The Apostle Paul says, if he owes you any debt, I'll pay it myself. Just wipe his debt clean. Don't, I'll pay it. I, Paul, am writing this with my own hand. I will repay. Not to mention that you owe me your very life, your very self. So it's just kind of like a little bit of extra there to say, do the right thing. Please, I'm begging you. Verse 20, yes, brother, let me have some benefit from you in the Lord. Refresh my heart in Messiah. He says, do this as a favor to me. He says, it will give me such blessing. It will give me such joy. It will refresh my heart if you receive Onesimus back as more than just a slave, but as a brother. More than just a brother, as if it was me that was coming to visit you. Verse 21, having confidence in your obedience, I write to you, knowing that you will do even more than what I say. So the Apostle Paul says, look, I have confidence because I know the type of man you are. I know you're a loving man. Hey, your name's Philemon. You love people. You love brothers. You have a congregation that's meeting in your own home. You've opened your own home to the whole community. And he says, I'm confident that this letter that I'm sending by the very hand of Onesimus, I'm certain that you're going to do the right thing. You're going to actually go above and beyond what I ask you to do. Verse 22, at the same time also prepare a guest room for me, for I hope that through your prayers I will be given back to you. So here Paul is maybe kind of giving a little prophecy here. He's kind of, some hope. He's like, look, I believe I'm going to be released one day. I believe that I'm going to get out from under this house arrest, and when I do, I'm going to come and visit you because I want to visit my brothers and sisters in Ephesus, my brothers and sisters in Colossae. I want to visit you. So prepare a room for me. That's another indication that Philemon was probably rich because he had a guest room, right? A guest house. And you know what this reminds me of? This reminds me of the Old Testament account of Elisha the prophet and the Shunammite woman. Because Elisha would always travel this certain way, and he would always stop at this woman's house and stay. Her and her husband would put him up. And the Shunammite woman says, he comes so often, why don't we build a guest room on top of the roof for him? Just a simple thing, just a bed and a chair and, whatever. And so that's kind of what that reminds me of, like Elisha's room. Okay, verse 23. Epaphras, my fellow prisoner in Messiah Yeshua, greet you. So do Mark. Now Mark, this is believed to be the same Mark, John Mark, in other words, the nephew of Barnabas, right? And remember what caused the split between Paul and Barnabas? What's this little pansy doing on a mission trip with us? He's a sissy, he's a baby, he's a crybaby and wants to go home. What good is he on this mission trip? Paul was saying, basically. And Barnabas is like, well, if you feel that way, we'll just part ways and I'll take John Mark with me and you can take Silas. But as John Mark matured and as, he was no longer green but a seasoned veteran missionary, Paul's like, wow, I really misjudged him. I really kind of, I got this guy all wrong. He's profitable. He's useful. Because we see in Acts chapter 12, verses 12 and 25, and Colossians 4:10, John Mark, like Onesimus, was once useless, and he became useful. So this is the Mark that's speaking of. Erasticus, Now, Rasticus was with Paul during the riot in Ephesus. You remember the riot in Ephesus where they were saying, "Great is Diana of the Ephesians! Great is Diana of the Ephesians!" They were getting ready to rip Paul apart until some guards came and saved him because he was a Roman citizen. He had that right to be saved. That's found in Acts chapter 19, verses 23 through 41, and Colossians 4:10. So that's the same Aristarchus, so we're kind of putting two and two together here. Demas and Luke, and we see that they're with the Apostle Paul and also mentioned in Colossians 4:14. So do John Mark, Aristarchus, Demas, and Luke, my fellow workers. May the grace of our Lord Messiah Yeshua be with you, be with your spirit. Amen. So, Onesimus was likely a native of Phrygia, so he would have been a dark-complected Turk. And the apostolic pictures of Bishop Onesimus or Saint Onesimus or whatever, he was seen as a dark-complected man. So that kind of gives credence that he was probably a native of Phrygia and a Turk. He eventually became martyred. And that's pretty interesting. Onesimus became a martyr, and he was martyred under Emperor Domitian. Domitian was like Nero. He was just a crazy, lunatic, bad guy emperor that killed all Christians, all Jews, all believers in Messiah Yeshua. So Onesimus met his end in 95 AD. He had his legs and thighs broken with bludgeons, and then he was stoned to death. So it's interesting. This is the letter to Philemon, but really this has kind of more become the story of Onesimus, really, in a sense. So we went through an entire book in 50 minutes. Cool. Isn't that pretty cool? Oh, book. I say book, it's a letter. So that's the letter of Philemon, so I hope you really enjoyed it and learned something that you didn't know before.
Yeah, I did.
I did.
Thanks
Awesome.
for watching. Don't forget to press the like button as well as the subscribe button if you haven't done so already, and the notification bell that'll let you know every time I make a new video. And don't forget to share this with a friend. Also, visit our website at abrahamsdescendants.com. Thanks. Shalom.